So I'd like to queue up our first speaker here, Fiona Wild. Now, Fiona's come to us today, to Lana's point, this is an international event. She is in Belgium, and her and I had a very great conversation yesterday. She was walking down one of the nicest cities in Europe, I'm convinced, is Bruges. And welcome, Fiona. Hopefully you can see us. For those, if you can't see the room, we have 100 people in the room here that are all staring intently at your photo, just off to my right and to my left. So you can speak as if we are all in your living room here having a conversation. Now, Fiona.
Thank you, Monty.
Yeah, great. Welcome, Fiona. Fiona is the VP of Sustainability for BHP. And in Saskatchewan, we would know BHP because of their mine. That's not the Jansen mine that's been such a centerpiece of potash exploration here. But she has a global assignment. She lives in Melbourne. But her accent is not Australian. She informed me yesterday that she's actually UK-born, I believe, is what our conversation was. But she has a direct connection to Saskatchewan. Fiona, maybe I'll cue you up to tell us about your direct link to Saskatchewan.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Marty, for inviting me. And I'm sorry for being in a hotel room in Brussels. Normally I am in Melbourne, but as you might be able to tell from my accent, I am from the UK originally. My connection with Saskatchewan is it goes back about 80 years now. So my mum was actually, she was born in the UK, and during the Second World War, she was fortunate enough to be evacuated from the north of England to Regina. So I have relatives and friends in Regina, and I have a really strong sense of gratitude to the people of Saskatchewan for keeping my family and my mum safe. So thank you very much for the value of that contribution that you made to my family. It's much appreciated.
All right, well, welcome, Fiona. Now we have 15 minutes here, and you and I had talked about a couple really important things that you wanted to share with the group here. Now, the first one is as it relates to decarbonization. And, you know, I'm a layperson from Saskatchewan, and I think about a global mining company being net zero. I don't even understand how it's possible, Fiona. Help me see our way through this.
It is a really tricky challenge. And so when we're thinking about making commitments to reduce emissions, we have to think about where those emissions come from and what actions we can put in place to reduce them. When you think about mining companies like BHP, generally speaking, our emissions come from three different places. So they come from the electricity that we consume, they come from the diesel that we burn in trucks, and then they tend to come from things what we call fugitive emissions, which are other types of emissions often associated with, for example, coal mining. So when we're thinking about emissions, we need to understand where it makes the most sense to focus in the first instance, and then how we would progress emissions reductions over time. Broadly speaking, around the world for BHP, the first place we go to is around electricity and where we source our electricity. So you would have seen a big shift in the way that BHP sources electricity over the last few years. We've significantly shifted from coal-fired and gas-fired power to renewables. And that has a issue there is that we're using trucks which are really, really large. And so you can't buy trucks off the shelf. Well, not off the shelf. You can't buy trucks that are actually large enough at the moment to replace those mechanical drive trucks or diesel driven trucks that we use at the moment. So what we have to do there is about working in So working with Caterpillar and Komatsu and others to make sure that when we need to buy the next generation of trucks, we can actually buy electrified trucks. And that's a really complicated proposition because those trucks aren't available now. But also we have to start thinking, how would we charge them and make sure that we continue to have, for example, 24-hour operations at our lines. So there's some practical limitations around how we can shift over to electric drive trucks, even beyond making sure these things are available when we need to buy them. The third area is around what we call fugitive emissions. And as I mentioned, these are largely associated with emissions associated with coal mining, for example, and some of the methane gas that can be produced when we're producing coal. And there it's really about thinking through research and development and new technologies to capture that methane when it's released. So when you're thinking about decarbonising mining, it's about electricity, and then it's about trucks, and then it's about what you might call residual emissions. But we've set a goal to get to net zero by 2050. We've got a clear path to reduce our emissions by at least 30% by 2030. And currently, I'm glad to say, we're ahead of schedule.
Oh, well, that's a good way to end that statement, actually. And so I think I also heard that in order to hit your net zero, do you need to buy carbon offsets then, or are you going to achieve this in your own internal mechanisms?
We're trying to achieve this, what we call real structural abatement, which is a kind of legalistic way of just saying reducing emissions permanently. So what we'd like to focus on is changing the way we operate so that these emissions are just not produced, so we don't need to utilize offsets. Challenging thing is that when you look at the opportunities to reduce emissions, they get harder over time. So as I mentioned, changing coal and gas-fired power to renewables is relatively straightforward in most locations around the world. Thinking through shifting from diesel-powered trucks to electric trucks, we can start to see how we can work with manufacturers to get those trucks available, probably towards the late 2020s, early 2030s. But for some of the other emissions, we can't yet see a pathway to reduce emissions completely. So what we need to think about is the role of offset going forward. So we're not going to use offsets as an excuse to delay emissions reductions because we want to actually deliver real sustainable reductions. We might need to use offsets as we get towards 2050 if there are emissions that we can't reduce because there aren't technological solutions available. And really that's why companies and countries talk about net zero rather than absolute zero, because it's a recognition that there are some emissions that are really hard to reduce, but there are some emissions that are easier, and you can actually create offsets from working harder in some sectors than others. And so when you're thinking about the use of offsets, you want to make sure that not only do they have credibility in terms of reducing carbon, but also that they can generate other types of co-benefits. So for example, community development opportunities or environment and biodiversity benefits. So offsets, in a sense, are a last port of call, but when you're utilizing offsets, you want to make sure that you're using the absolute best quality that can give you these sort of community and environment co-benefits.
Okay, you know about the involvement of Indigenous communities. I think you had this example out of Australia that might apply here, but I wonder if your thoughts, our room here is a mix of First Nations people from across Canada, but you also have a global mindset. So where do Indigenous people fit in?
It's a really interesting question. As people, really critical partners for BHP. The reality is that many or most of our operated assets are located on or near lands or territory that are traditionally owned or under the customary use of Indigenous peoples. So we engage with Indigenous peoples to understand their environmental, their social and their cultural development priorities, because we want to ensure that those Indigenous peoples benefit from our presence over the long term. So we consider their views as we progress through every stage of development. And what we're increasingly seeing isn't about resources companies thinking through the outcomes they want to achieve and influencing or encouraging others to come with them. It's about co-creation of solutions. And that involves companies like BHP being prepared to step back and recognize that we don't have the answers. And things may take longer than we'd expected. And we may not always know what the outcome's going to be. Those co-created solutions are the ones that actually value for all of the different shareholders and stakeholders who are involved. In terms of carbon management, there really are opportunities already for us to work with Indigenous peoples, particularly in terms of how we improve environmental outcomes and these community outcomes I mentioned earlier on. So a couple of examples I'll give you. We have a mine site in the Pilbara region of Western Australia, the Yandi mine, and we developed an Indigenous-led site rehabilitation program. So it's looking at how we can rehabilitate the land that previously been mined. And we've worked with the local Indigenous people, the Banjima people, to develop an organisation that is focused on native seed growth and planting. And that Banjima are now expected to be planting around 20,000 trees over the next 5 years. And what it's doing is it's bringing the Banjima into the local workforce, and it's providing a really sustainable solution for those individuals, as well as driving fantastic environmental outcomes for the site. Another example through our BHP Foundation, we've got a program called the 10 Deserts Project, and that's actually in bringing about Indigenous land management of around 35% of Australia's land mass, which, as you would know, is huge. And what it does, it supports ongoing expansion of an Indigenous Rangers program. So understanding of the natural environment and how land can be best managed is really, really valuable to miners. And you'll find that we're starting to recognize that and value that far more now than we ever have before.
Okay, my last question. We have just a couple minutes left. I'm always interested in the future. So you've obviously been living the world of sustainability and carbon, et cetera. If you fast forwarded 10 years out, what will we be talking about, or what do we need to be talking about today to make sure we're ready for 10 years out?
Good question. Things are moving really fast. So I used to think that I kind of would have to start thinking maybe sort of 2 or 3 years ahead. What I'm finding at the moment is things are moving so fast that the things that you expect today can sometimes be out of date in a month or 2 months. So the pace of change that we're seeing is really fast. But I think one of the underlying themes that we're seeing is this interconnection between climate change and biodiversity. So we're seeing biodiversity and climate change, or biodiversity loss and climate change, really amplifying the sensitivity of natural systems. And what you're starting to see is companies thinking a lot more about how to address these twin crises of climate and biodiversity loss. So you start to see companies thinking about things like nature positivity. And what that really means is making sure that what you're aiming for is a future of the future. So that might be around biodiversity, ecosystem services, natural capital, which is greater than the current state. So creating positive benefit. What that means is, though, we have to start valuing nature. So one of the best ways to encourage companies like BHP and others to really think about the impacts of our activities on nature is to put a value on nature. And we're doing a lot of work now in terms of natural capital accounting, which is a natural value on nature, which enables it to compete and win against other forms of financial value. And that is one of the most important things to do. And also, I think one of the most important things you'll start to see permeating through. In the same way that carbon pricing or pricing of carbon is becoming more recognized, I think broadening that out to think about the value of nature and the criticality of the ecosystems that we operate within, once that can be really valued alongside conventional ways of thinking about financial value, you'll start to see the sustainable value being delivered through companies like BHP in collaboration with their communities.
Oh, thank you for that. Actually, you really set us up for a panel coming up here in about 30 minutes on ESGs and how we measure, manage, whether we can monetize this or should we monetize it. So, Fiona, I respect that it's late in the night there. Thank you so much for giving us your time and joining us. As an appreciation of your time, we are going to get in your hands this book, Indigenomics, and our keynote speaker later today, Caroline Hilton, wrote this book, and I think you'd really appreciate it. It's a great read. So thank you again, Fiona, for joining us, and please join me in thanking Fiona.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Have a great conversation.
Marty, thank you very much for that. A few key takeaways between you and I on this. First of all, we're so fortunate to have BHP Billiton as a significant corporate citizen in Saskatchewan. They've stayed the line, they've held the course, and they seem to be talking the talk and walking the talk and making this work. But really, at the end of the day as well, we're going to start asking some of our corporate leaders how they feel about buying carbon credits and taking carbon credits to meet their net 2050, their net zero 2050s. How do they feel about applying social license to that carbon credit as well? I think we're going to start having that conversation through the piece, because every one of these corporations has a very specific mandate to social license and the social license issues that are important to them. And I think the concept of combining an environmental bona fide voluntary carbon credit and a social license issues really go hand in hand. So I think that's the challenge that we're going to have to start pushing back, is what we're going to have to do.
Yeah, thanks, Lionel. And maybe my last thoughts on what Fiona shared, this nature positivity piece that she introduced us to here. For those of you in the land that are the rights holders of the land, this is exactly what we've been talking about, is the idea that they're putting true value and true meaning on how we use our land. So yeah, thanks again to Fiona, Lionel, great comments as well. I completely agree.